So colleagues, welcome to this 7th webinar series organized by the Waterland Ecosystems Program and on the topic of From Research to Resilience. Welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us from various places. Okay. This particular session focuses on inclusive land restoration. We have a really interesting program for you. I'll give a brief introduction, and then there will be 2 Ignite talks by 2 WLE researchers, Dr. Ermias Better Mariam from ICRAF, or World Agroforestry, and Dr. Padmaja Ravula from ICRISAT. And the topics that they're going to speak on is presented here, and they will be speaking to you in great detail about this. Then we have a panel discussion and where we bring together 3 very interesting panelists. We bring Dr. Pramod Kumar Joshi, who was former IFPRI, former Niti Aayog, the policy body of Government of India, and currently the Economics Research Association of India Director. We have Dr. Marlene Elias from the Alliance of Biodiversity and CGIAR, and we have Dr. Gete Zeleke from the Water and Land Resource Center from Addis Ababa University in partnership with the University of Bern. So each of these 3 panelists will be speaking about their own experiences in their countries of work, and also very much related to, the challenges of putting into practice restoration agendas with a focus on inclusion. And then, of course, we have a lot of room for discussions and feedback from you, which we are really looking forward to. But first, let me give you a little insight into WLE and restoration, gender and inclusion. So restoration is really one of the key themes that WLE has focused on. WLE, the Waterland Ecosystems Program of the CGIAR, has 5 flagships, and all of these speak to restoration. And gender and inclusion is a cross-cutting issue across these different flagships. So in that context, actually, given when you think of the One CGIAR agenda and the move towards more sustainable food systems, also taking into account environmental degradation and restoration, WLE was really a front runner to this new One CGIAR goal agenda. And what WLE had 3 very foundational goals, which was really, can we produce cutting-edge, new transdisciplinary knowledge on the nexus between water, land, and ecosystems? And in the process of doing it, can we also build capacity of CG researchers and also the various partners that we work with? And how do these 2, the knowledge and the capacity, result in policy relevant outcomes? So at a certain time, when we were working on gender and inclusion in WLE, we shifted focus from just the process of, focusing on women, engaging women, to really adopting what is called a gender transformative lens, to tackling not just the symptoms of gender inequality, but really understanding, unpacking, and trying to transform the root causes of gender inequality. So in the process of doing that, we've done different things, and we've done things differently. So here you have Dr. Ermias, who is a biophysical scientist who won a WLE gender research grant. And Dr. Padmaja Ravula will talk about an interesting policy mapping process where we enable 2 young female researchers to really understand the hierarchy of gender know-how in restoration agendas and landscapes in India. And all of this was very interesting because it also brought into light the challenges that we have in really putting into practice restoration agendas. So these are some of the outputs and outcomes that we've worked with. One of them, which we would like to share with you, one of which is a special issue in the journal Ecological Restoration, where we've asked the question, restoration for whom and by whom, a feminist political ecology of restoration. This was 3 different CGIAR centers who worked together on this special issue with a lot of external researchers. And we've also encouraged really this process of getting biophysical and disciplinary scientists within the CGIAR and outside to really engage with the topic of gender and transformative changes. So what have we learned in this process is that, the policy intent is very much there. And there is also a move towards a more transformative agenda in relation to gender and inclusion. However, the way we tend to do gender still tends to be mostly instrumentalist, where the focus is on adding in women and often as an afterthought, and also really only unpacking gender at the community and household levels. So Dr. Padmaja will talk to you a bit more about this. What we've also learned, what Dr. Bete Mariam will talk, is about the uneven gender capacity and know-how within institutional landscapes, and how this is not very dissociated from, the values and mindsets that guide what is science and how we should do research. So this issue from a feminist perspective that Marlene Elias will speak to is also about, as scientists, and when we talk about science, can we really claim that we function objectively, and objectivity is the outcome of science interventions. And finally, what we've also really worked with and understood is that, if we are to go about bringing transformative change, which is we require changing from the inside out and really tackling institutional cultures, which not only impact research agendas, outcomes, and outputs, but they also shape what we can do within certain contexts to bring about change. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Ermias Bete Mariam to speak to his presentation. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, Deepa, and then hello, colleagues, and then thank you for coming to hear what we are presenting today. I'm Ermias Bete Mariam from the World Agroforestry and C4, based in Nairobi. And then as Deepa mentioned, I'm a biophysical scientist, and you may wonder how this biophysical scientist is going to present on a topic on gender. And this is a test of also how we learned, while a biophysical scientists, we have been working closely with gender experts within the Water, Land, and Ecosystem Program. And then this is just to share, what is really the basic things that we have learned in one of the projects, and then that's what I'm going to present. And then, of course, I would like to see also in terms of policy and then policy influence. Yes, I think that this is just a case of one project in Ethiopia. And then the basic 3 things that we were thinking to do within the water and land ecosystem was really understanding how gender is addressed in restoration policies, and then guidelines and manuals within key stakeholders. In this case, we consider the Forestry and Environment Commission, and then the Catholic Relief Service, which are really major players, to some extent within Ethiopian context. And we reviewed what they think and what they do, in line with, comparing with, what is a transformative gender looks like. So that's one of the things we did. The second thing is examining whether how gender is addressed in landscape restoration in scientific literatures in Ethiopia. So there was a group who really reviewed as many literature as possible from Ethiopia, and then see how gender is really addressed in landscape restoration. When I say landscape restoration, sometimes the term could be integrated watershed management, it could be sustainable land management, but the framework is the landscape restoration. And the third one is to see if there is any empirical evidence from the ground how gender is really addressed in a subset of projects. Then we picked 3 projects from 3 regions in Ethiopia, one from Amhara region, another from Oromia region and another from the southern region, and then try to see how this thing is really happening on the ground. And then while designing the project, we really see into the guideline in terms of how gender responsive program should look like, and then what is the risk of also not engaging or ignoring gender in restoration projects. Yes, and then on the first one, I think there is, as Deepa also mentioned, there is an intent there, and then but capacities within institutions is really lacking, because when you ask the commission, they're interested to integrate gender, but when we ask them how they do it, I think the capacity is not there. So sometimes you see organizations having a gender guideline, but oftentimes, there is an interest, but they really express that they need a capacity and then to strengthen. When I say capacity, technical and then also financial capacities are also required if you really make a meaningful contribution. Also, lack of synergies is also something, because you can see, in the Ministry of Agriculture, they may have their own way, but they are working on the same watershed, on the same landscape, with the same, for instance, land degradation neutrality target at a national scale. And then when you go to the commission or an NGO, they may have also a different one. I think harmonizing that could also leverage that some of the gaps they really mentioned. Yes, and then of course, these are the two things that we observed in this research, and then we suggested also what should be done and what is really the basic things. On the second one, I think we collected 312 peer-reviewed papers from Ethiopia only on gender and landscape restoration related things. And then one thing which we observed is there is an increasing trend in the use of social inclusive keywords. And then I think gender and social inclusion, I think the number of keywords indicated in literature is increasing. That means researchers are more, using this kind of things, terminologies, and they are also engaged in kind of gender-related lenses in their research, so which is really interesting. But that is still not something which could really solve the problem as such. But from research perspective, I think there is an interest in using these terms. And then when you also evaluate in terms of how gender blind or sensitive or transformative, some of this literature show that, I think most of the literature are not really considering gender as such. So they talk more on biophysical restoration, on soil and water conservation and stuff like that. However, still there are some, about 30%, which also mentioned, gender sensitivity in their literature. So it shows that, the trend that we have learned in terms of research, I think that can also inform researchers as well. Yes, and then the third one is, what is the empirical evidence? This research is not just completed, but we collected data, and then we have some basic descriptive statistics, so to say. And then some of the observation we have that, the root cause of land degradation, the way it was perceived by men and women, I think, most of the biophysical features like slope was mentioned by men group, and then women are also very interestingly interested on the management side, like crop rotation. And then, it's really, there is a bit of differences in terms of the way they look at it in terms of the root cause of land degradation. And then when it comes to restoration outcomes in our study, I think both men and women more or less have a similar perspective and an understanding on restoration outcomes. And then engagement in leadership, and then I think more men than women are engaged in restoration decision-making, and then bodies particularly, because when we have committees, when we have, these kind of groups. So that's also what we have seen, but we will try to come up with a real quantitative answer, and then why this is happening in that particular landscape. So this is also a kind of example in terms of what we did in terms of method is that in every household we try to ask both men and women from each household, so that we have like a 50-50% data, and then it was very easy to disaggregate it by gender. So in terms of engagement and restoration, I think both men and women engaged in government-led, non-government-led, and community-led. And then I think almost half of the women are engaged in both NGO and then government-led restoration program, but still men played a major role in engagement in this case. And then on the second one, although women are engaged during community-wide consultations, oftentimes they're consulted when there is a group or mass gathering, but they are not so much consulted at the beginning, during the inception of the project, and then at the end when the project is about to implement it. So at what phase of the project that women are more engaged, that also tells something that, they are there just mainly for participation, but in terms of real decision-making, for planning at the beginning and executing, restoration at the end, is really a bit lacking. So that also tells in terms of planning and then also implementing projects. So I have 2 more slides on policy scripts, and then I was really trying to see how SDGs considered gender-related specific indicators. And then almost 4 SDGs do not have like gender-specific indicators. That was a fact. And then it was SDG 6, clean water and sanitation, which has a lot to do with women, men, and gender, but you don't have that specific gender-specific indicators. SDG 9, SDG 12, SDG 14, they don't. So almost 12 of them they have, and then interestingly, my interest is on SDG 15, life on land, particularly in their target on land degradation neutral world. So they don't have that gender-specific indicators. So the 3 indicators are biophysical, that means trends in land cover, trends on land productivity, and trends on soil carbon. So it's often been criticized that they don't have any socioeconomic, particularly gender type of indicators, but we are trying to really use all those 3 biophysical indicators to have at least implications to gender. Yes, and then when we come to the UNECCD in particular, in the previous COP, and then we try to influence a little bit to consider gender, and then we will be able to at least integrate these 3 bullet points within country parties, and then it was really accepted. So that is one of, I would say, the contribution of water land ecosystem people to influence land degradation neutrality country parties to consider gender in targeting from the beginning when they really target setting in land degradation neutrality, during intervention, and then in their land use planning. So there is also another technical report being in preparation for the next COP, which is going to be next year in Cote d'Ivoire. We are also trying to bring in gender and social inclusion in their policy, particularly on the report on integrated land use planning for land degradation neutrality. So this is my final thoughts from what I have seen. There is a positive trend in gender and social inclusion in landscape restoration policy and research, which is really, I think it is positive, and then to make it more strong and meaningful is what we do. In terms of initiatives, also other opportunities like the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration is a big agenda coming, which is related to landscape restoration. I think this is also really time to really bring in our experience, our thoughts into this kind of new initiative so that there will not be too much, thing missing at the end of the program. So in terms of evidence and research, I think investment into long-term research is important because oftentimes in gender, you go there, you have quick survey and then conclusions. So I think it should be a mainstream research by its own, and then there should be enough investment to have a long-term research. And then oftentimes we need to think beyond the gender disaggregated data because there is a lot of historical things, there are a lot of cultural and social things happening. So it's not about the data and the figure, but it is very important to go beyond this gender disaggregated data. Of course, we need to have like integrated research, transboundary research, like we are biophysical scientists, but we are working together with gender experts, and then that knowledge exchange between the 2 disciplines, really that blended knowledge really is really helping. That's what I have learned in this program. So in terms of approach, this is my last point. I think gender mainstreaming is a process rather than just a goal. So I think we need to continuously build on a stepwise process, and then we need to look at the trend rather than really absolutely looking at the goal by its own. And then gender is a cross-cutting topic in many institutions because it could be thinly spreading. So there will be no devs, or there could be one gender expert in a given organization, and that person is really contributing to a number of things. So there might not be, a very focused output. So it will be also, there is a bit of risk of being, have few gender experts, they are already there, have a checklist and then checking things, but it should go really beyond that if you want to make a transformative change in that front. So in terms of policy, I think I should agree there is a policy intent there, but capacities are really often lacking, and then we need to really invest on that. So these are some of the thoughts I really came up with, and then with that I will end my presentation, and then I thank you, all of you, for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ermias. That was a very great presentation, and there are already some comments coming for you in the chat box, so I would ask you to refer to that. But for us at WLE, what was most interesting about this whole process was here was a group of mostly male biophysical scientists who were unpacking with the challenges of doing gender and knowing gender. And that was for us, the most significant outcome of this whole project and exercise. I will invite now Padmaja to go deep into the institutional landscape to identify what sort of challenges that she encountered in India in relation to restoration. Over to you, Padmaja.
Thank you, Deepa, and welcome everybody to this interesting session. So thank you all those who joined virtually for this presentation and the session. Now, just to ensure that I have, like, I don't, can you see my screen? Can everybody see my screen?
Yes,
please?
we can. You can put it back on slideshow.
It's on the slide, presentation mode.
Okay. I don't know.
You can see, make it presentation mode. Yes.
Yeah, okay. So just to, so welcome everybody. And I would like to switch off my video for some time because of a bad internet connection. And therefore I'll get started with the presentation soon. So what my presentation or my talk is all about is finding our way into the black box. And as you can see from my introductory slide, it says, unpacking systemic gender inequality across institutional landscapes. So this study is a part of a larger study which was implemented by Equisat along with my colleagues Ananya and Kavita, and also collaborated through IMI, led by Deepa Joshi and Arunima. So let me not waste a lot of time, but go straight into the presentation. I don't know why I'm not able to move the screen. Yeah, so I don't think I need to introduce Equisat, but as you can see, our research activities are focused on crops of immense value, especially on nutrition and economics of the semi-arid tropics. So we work mostly on dryland cereals and green legumes in the semi-arid tropics. Now, gender norms and values of institutional stakeholders is the black box of gender research. So that's what I actually would like to start. That's my main message of this whole presentation, and I start with the message. But how did I come to that message? As you can see, gender research has been an integral part of CGIAR system, and there's a rich institutional history of using gender as an analytical category in the works of various CG institutions and other institutions as well. But the gaze of gender researchers in most of these institutions has been mainly directed towards the communities to understand inter and intra-household allocation, distribution of resources, looking at their different needs, preferences, etc., of both the male and female farmers, and what are the diverse adaptation levels based on gender, to name a few. So this downward gaze on the community, because of this downward gaze on the community, we've been able to understand or have a greater understanding of, what are the barriers or the constraints to adoption of a technology, or what is the gaps, like on knowledge, attitudes, practices, etc. That we have learned. But still not much on the ground has changed for women. So why is it? So one of the things that we understood from our research was that there is limited understanding of the organizational spaces where we operate, the values and the norms of the different institutions and our partners within whom and where we work and engage with. So it is often at the level of institutional actors that the intent to address gender issues in agriculture gets diluted, sometimes misinterpreted, or sometimes reinterpreted, which has significant impacts on policy. So we appeal to the theoretical background by Swartween, where she talks about heteropatriarchies in irrigation institutions to under organizations. And we talk about reflexivity, about positionality of institutional actors, which is important to understand the role, their understanding of gender and their role in watershed projects. So this was the two broader aims of this study, where we look at existing values, norms that guide watershed research, and then look at gender perspectives of each institutional actor. And then the second part of the study, which we are still which is work in progress, is to design initiatives to improve the competencies of the different actors where they can include gender as an analytical category. So We use a methodology called studying up and studying power, which has been, it's quite a methodology that was used in the early 70s, but then followed up in 90s. And now we have thought that that was one of a very good methodology to understand how different actors look at gender in their own work. And this was done with the help of two early career female researchers based at ICRISAT and IMI. And we identified participants through snowball sampling methodology, and we had conducted in-depth semi-structured interviews on teams because of the mobility restrictions of the COVID-19 pandemic, sorry. So what do we mean by hydropatriarchies in watershed research? The most easiest or the most common reason that I can give is that we critically looked at the role of watershed organizations in enabling gender transformation and the key challenges therein. Watershed policy in India has attempted to address community level differences and diversity, although less successfully. However, watershed organizations and what happens within them, the unequal relationships that organizations have with the community, and the norms, perceptions, and values that guide these organizations remain relatively less researched. So in the context of irrigation organizations, Ratwin proposes the concept of hydropatriarchy, that is, organizations that are androcentric in both their approach towards technology and in their workforce composition. We find a similar study emerging in watershed organizations in the Indian context as well. In the case study, we will elaborate about how hydropatriarchy manifests through domination of biophysical sciences over social sciences in various ways, such as prioritizing ecological goals of conservation and increasing groundwater or domestic use, etc., but less on economic, political, social, and environmental transformations. And this was our finding from the study, where we found that when we spoke to different actors and from different institutions in watershed research, we found that there were difficulties in accessing institutional actors and scheduling interviews, prioritizing biophysical sciences over social sciences, and limited realization of opportunity cost of choosing environmental goals over social goals. Also, we understood that watershed programs are often designed and implemented in most cases in a top-down nature, which is again a donor-driven agenda. And there are also limitations of funding and tight project timelines. So you can see one excerpt or one quote from a government institution actor about watershed research. Then the second one that we found from practitioners was there's a narrow representation of women as gender. And those who do gender also tend to equate gender with women and simplistically equate increased participation in projects, monetary gains with women's empowerment. Gender is rarely addressed as a complex set of power relations along with other axes of caste, class, education, and age. Thus, there is an increasing call for integrated approaches to watershed development projects that allow representation of local knowledge and diverse voices. Again, another quote from one of the practitioners whom we interviewed, and you can see what I've said. These are some of the references, but with this small presentation, I would like to stop here and thank you for giving an opportunity, but I would be happy to contribute to the discussion and deliberations. Happy to clarify any questions as well. Over to you, Deepa.
Thanks very much, Padmaja. So I think this is really interesting, and it sort of links to what Ermia said, that, you know, the intent, policy intent is there, but is the capacity there? And have we paid enough attention to building capacities institutionally across the landscape of different institutions implementing restoration programs? So there are two questions in the chat box. I think there was one by Kerry that Ermias has answered to in the chat. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that. There was also a question from Lei, but at this particular point of time, we invite more questions, and we could also have people, you know, step in and ask questions if you want to. But Ermias, would you like to answer the question that Lei has asked that I've also resent to your?
Yeah,
to you?
I will try. And then I think the purpose of this meeting, because I have also, enough gender experts around me to also to complement if and then when we put, I will share a publication which we use like a reference. What does it mean in terms of, the gender equity continuum, I would say, completely from gender unequal to, gender transformative. And then there are some features that we picked from gender transformative. Basically, a gender transformative approach or program or project need to really understand the root cause of inequalities between men and women in engaging in this kind of projects, and then try to really come up with a transformative means to overcome any kind of burdens or any kind of challenges that could be coming from because of the gender inequality. So I think when it is transformative, it has to it has to change the systemic problem. Sometimes it is not just making a kind of changing or keeping the balance, but it has to have a kind of real change so that that inequality and then need to be addressed. So that is what we say, that is what we need to target. And then what we did in that project is that in this project that we'll try to map where we are standing right now. So having that as a benchmark, and then I will be very happy also to share some ideas and publications for me. Thanks. And then others also could Deepa yourself might also add something if you wish.
Thank you, Ermia. So just in the interest of time, we can now move to the panel discussions. We have 3 panelists that I've already introduced to all of you. And what I would ask each of them, starting from Dr. Pramod Joshi, and then followed by Marlene Elias, and then finally Dr. Gete Zeleke, is to answer one specific question each, also speaking to their own experience, both personal and professional, in the work that they do. So the very first question to Dr. Joshi is, what are the key challenges to putting into practice a socio-ecological framing of restoration? Dr. Joshi, would you like to speak to that, please? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Deepa. Thank you so much. At the outset, I thank organizers for including me in this panel discussion, which was the theme is of my interest. I worked on this area for a long time, especially on rehabilitation of degraded lands, especially in the rain-fed area, in the irrigated areas. And I got opportunity to work in the watershed management and development. We reviewed roughly more than 600 watersheds and did the meta-analysis and drew lessons on success of watersheds and the failures of the watersheds. I also worked on the sustainable intensification of resilient agriculture system. And lastly, we started working on the climate smart agriculture and tried to see different intervention from the climate smart lenses. And we tried to see watershed from the climate smart lens, and we realized that watersheds really were the climate smart because they are increasing productivity, improving the resilience, and also increasing the carbon sequestration. So all the 3 conditions of carbon, this climate smart agriculture is met by the watershed program. So initially, when these watersheds were designed, this was not intended to have the climate smart, but they are climate smart agriculture. Both the presentations were excellent presentation, and they have given that how the social dimensions are important. And you mentioned that the social aspects are being neglected in restoration of land and natural resources, and more aspects of technical and ecosystems are being given importance. Studies have shown in the past what I did, and we found that the social aspects play very important role in making especially the watershed program great success. The social groups, gender issues, caste, religion, the farming societies, they form the networks to exchange the ideas, exchange the technology, and their own conversation they try to see that how they can increase their production and they can access to the markets. So through network, and these social groups help each other in achieving their own goals. Now I'll just give three important aspects how these success of including social dimensions help in achieving the goals of restoring watersheds program. But one important thing I have realized that the success depends upon a perfect blending between four dimensions. It's not only one aspect, but if you have a perfect blending of technical aspects, means what kinds of crops, what kinds of structures you are putting, what kinds of technologies you are introducing, and then the ecological dimensions, the natural resource management, especially soil and water resources, how you are conserving including the agroforestry, then the economic aspects, benefits, income, returns to the labor, and then social dimensions, equity related issues, benefits to women, and the employment aspects. If there is a perfect blending of those four pillars, then only we have the success. If one pillar is missing, the success will be less in implementing the program. The second important aspect, when you have social groups, especially the participation, people's participation is very, very important in the restoration of natural resources and degraded lands. So people's participation, what we have observed, that if you have smaller groups, if you have a homogeneous groups, the success rate increases. In large and heterogeneous groups, the success rates is very low. And also in large and heterogeneous groups, the interest of poor and marginalized is being oversighted. So more the voice is heard of the large high income strata, or when you have the heterogeneous groups. We have calculated using the meta-analysis where we have high participation, the benefit cost ratio was 2.4. But when we have a low participation, especially when we are forming the social groups, the benefit cost ratio was 1.2. The typology of the social groups is also very important. How you are forming the social groups is very, very important, which is leading to the success of any program. The success is, more success we have observed in the low income areas where incomes are low, people are marginalized, the productivity levels are very low, the success rates are very high in those areas. So what lessons we have learned, based upon some of these studies, I'm just giving 5 lessons. One is the management of degraded lands, especially the degraded lands, using the watershed programs. The initial investment cost is very, very high. In all the programs, the cost is very high compared to any kind of genetic enhancement technologies which are being adopted by the farmers. We have also observed there are conflicting objectives of different groups in the watershed program. So one group has some objective, they want to maximize their income, some generate employment opportunities, some have objective of food production. Among women, it is more of the firewood, water. So there are lots of conflicting objectives, and there are trade-offs when you have conflicting objectives. So we need to minimize the trade-offs to maximize the utility of the entire society. The third, the lesson what we learned, that the social benefits, there are more social benefits. Immediately we can see more social benefits than the private benefits. Private benefits are not visible immediately. They are coming at later stage. So social benefits are more than the private benefits. Long-term benefits are more than the short-term benefits. So therefore, we need to see how we can distribute the benefits, how we can convert the social benefits into the private benefits. That's the challenging task for all of us, that converting social benefits into the private benefits. Most of the technologies, are in a package or in a bundle of technologies, and the farmers are adopting these packages or bundles, as per their own resource endowment or their own convenience, and wherever they are giving higher returns to them. So the package is not being adopted in one go. Then there are problems of the free riders. This is another problem. And finally, what should be our future research thrust? I would just like to list in 2-3 points. One is that future research, we need to prioritize and target watershed areas. We need to prioritize based upon some indicators and target where the watershed program should be implemented for higher returns, economic as well as social. Then we should also do investment strategy for watershed. We should prepare a white paper on investment strategy for watershed program. Then how to make policies and institutions for sharing equal benefits among those large farmers, vis-a-vis small farmers, landless laborers, and other marginalized farmers. And finally, develop approaches to assess contribution of watershed in ecosystem services, how we can contribute in ecosystem services so that the farmers can take advantage of ecosystem services. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Joshi. Please post your questions to Dr. Joshi on the chat while I invite Marlene Elias, who was the lead architect of a special issue on inclusive restoration. I posted the link to the special issue on the chat for everybody. So Marlene, the question to you is, what is different about a feminist approach to restoration? Would you kindly speak to that? Thanks so much.
Sure, thank you, Deepa. And also to the previous presenters and panelists who really brought to life very good examples of the we were trying to make in the special issue that you referred to, Deepa, that we entitled Restoration for Whom, by Whom. So by way of introduction, I'm the gender lead at the Alliance of Biodiversity International and CGIAR, and I've been working on restoration from a gender and social inclusion perspective for several years. I'm a researcher, I'm a human geographer, and what's really helped me in this space is having been trained actually as a biophysical scientist. So studying biology, environmental sciences, forest ecology, before moving into the social sciences. So that really helped me better understand the perspectives, the language, the trainings, the research environments of biophysical scientists. And when I moved into the social sciences, I was trying to find a way of bringing the biophysical and socio-political considerations of conservation and natural resource management together. So one approach that really resonated with me, and the one that we put forward in the framing of our special issue, is that of feminist political ecology, which is basically concerned with how politics and social relations and economics shape environmental management. So what I found particularly compelling about this approach is what may seem obvious, but is not necessarily always addressed or done in restoration initiatives, is that, well, basically what the proponents of feminist political ecology call progressive contextualization. So it's understanding these resource processes as shaped by the larger structures, the systemic barriers that embed them. So it starts from the perspective that we can understand the decisions that natural resource managers make. Often in the case of restoration projects, we're looking at small scale farmers, for example, without understanding the larger institutions and the structural barriers within which they face and within which they're embedded. So those include markets in terms of trade and tenure arrangements, formal policies and laws, but also informal rules, norms, and so on. So this is really, as I said, it may sound obvious, but it's a shift in what a large body of literature, this large body of literature that actually essentially puts the blame often for environmental degradation on small scale resource managers without understanding the contexts in which they operate, or that assumes that degradation is mainly a product of lack of knowledge or technological inputs among resource managers, which is certainly not the whole story. So in the special issue on restoration, we explain how 3 pillars of feminist political ecology help us understand these contexts essentially. And those 3 pillars are an attention to history, to scale, and to power relations. So feminist political ecology shows that understanding resource management processes requires understanding the history of places, not just the ecological history, but also the human history. And that if you don't do that, you're going to miss key issues. For example, overlapping claims to land that might have arisen over time, or trajectories of socio-ecological change and political economic drivers of degradation. And without understanding these, restoration initiatives are likely to create or to accentuate tensions among resource users and to be unsustainable. So history. The second very important point is looking at scale or multi-scalar analyses. So feminist political ecology calls for analyses of resource management that are multi-scale. So understanding, as I was saying, how local resource management processes are not only local, but that they are really the product of processes that occur also at meso and national and even international scales. So for example, the ways restoration agendas are set at a global scale. So Ermias mentioned the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. Well, the way that decade is framed, the principles that underpin it will influence even what happens at a very local scale. So the influence of scale. And third, and most critically, feminist political ecology calls attention to the importance of power relations in environmental management. So it recognizes that the gender and other social relations, as Dr. Joshi just mentioned, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, caste, age, all of those are really crucial in shaping who is able to access and control natural resources, what the risks, who's exposed to risks from restoration initiatives, what will be the distribution of costs and benefits, who will be able to participate, at which stage in the process, who will have influence in initiatives, and so on, as well as who actually gets to define restoration agendas, what counts as success in restoration, what indicators will be used, as Ermias mentioned, and whose knowledge and whose priorities count in restoration initiatives, and also whose doesn't, so who's essentially excluded from those initiatives. So what we show in the special issue, drawing on a number of case studies, is that examining these power relations, examining them across scales and over time and among multiple actors, so local resource managers, but also among and between local resource managers and researchers such as ourselves, other decision makers at multiple scales is really critical to being able to understand and to challenge these barriers to transformative change. And by calling attention to the diversity of and the legitimacy of local voices, that you can really open up the spaces for different visions and priorities and pathways for restoration. So we hope that this perspective can help develop initiatives that are more equitable and sustainable. Thanks, Deepa.
Thank you so much, Marlene. So as I mentioned, I posted the link to the special issue, so you can read the editorial that Marlene just elaborated and many other more papers on the link. And so last but not in the least, I would invite Dr. Gete Zeleke to speak. And I think this is so appropriate, the topic of what he's going to present. So we are at the start of the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration. And, you know, the dollar figures for achieving this have already been put across and are significant. But we are also at a time in our history where COVID-19 has ravaged economies at scale. So the question, the issue that Dr. Zeleke would be speaking about, how do we make sure that restoration investments can be more sustainable, efficient, and equitable? Over to you, Dr. Zeleke. Thank you.
Unmute yourself, sir.
You're muted.
This is very good icebreaker. Thank you, Deepa. And you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you for the organizers for giving me this opportunity to talk on these few issues. Thanks also to the two papers presenters. You know, my center has, the establishment of my center goes back to 1982, and it has to do, after learning the Ethiopian context, which has a huge natural resource capital, such as soil, landscape, water, and etc., biodiversity, but poorly managed and misunderstood. And as a result, you see a lot of land degradation affecting land productivity, as nearly 85% of the population is dependent on subsistence agriculture. The impact of land degradation is quite huge, and of course that results poverty also. On the other hand, the government initiated huge land restoration efforts, mainly since 1975. But we found out the effort are not supported by knowledge products or data, and we found out sustainability is a major issue at later stage. So the center, in collaboration with University of Bern, the first target was, okay, I think lack of data and information is a major challenge to inform policy and government to make sure proper land management practices are implemented in the different agroecology zones. And we established observatories where we collect data on land degradation, sedimentology, climate, hydrology, etc., land use, and some socioeconomic variables. But and we give them to make sure that policies and actions are more informed. However, later we found out sustainability is a major issue. It doesn't matter how much information you give. I think somehow one has to also put innovations on the ground and show also some kind of demonstration sites. So we established learning landscapes, or we call them multifunctional landscapes, and to show exactly what it takes to make sure that investments on land restoration can be sustainable and can improve livelihood of communities. And parallel to that, we also develop a guideline for sustainability, which can be customized to different countries, by the way, where we also include an inbuilt exit strategy in the guideline. We learned that many projects, they think about exit strategy when they finish the project. But I think if you want to enhance sustainability, you have to have an inbuilt exit strategy, and you have to start thinking about exit right from the very beginning. So I think these are the contexts where our center is working. And now I'll straight go back to the question I was asked to reflect. It is true that the Ethiopian government invests a lot on land restoration, but what should be done to make sure it is effective and sustainable and affect communities' livelihood? Although the investment is high, although there are some pocket success stories here and there, it's not comparable with the investment. Sustainability is a major issue, we found out. Then how can we improve sustainability and effectiveness? I think there are about 4 points I will raise. The first core issue is there seems a misunderstanding on the principles of landscape restoration or watershed management that we have to respect. There are 3 subcomponents there. One, understand the purpose of landscape restoration and watershed management is very important. So many think it's from the biophysical perspective, but I think the major purpose or the main outcome of landscape restoration are 3. One, it improves environmental quality and ecosystem services, such as food production, biomass production, water security, and the like. The second outcome is improve livelihoods. At the end of the day, unless and otherwise you enhance, improve livelihood of communities, it is useless. So this is the second outcome. The third outcome is it creates resilient ecosystem and community which are not affected by climate change shocks here and there. So clear understanding of the outcomes and the purpose of landscape restoration is a major issue, because this will affect the design of land restoration activities and the follow-up practice in general. So this was a gap, and I think this is what it needs to be done by the Ethiopian government, and that is what also we try to show in our learning landscapes. The second part of the principle, the subcomponent, is the planning process. We actually, to be honest, we misutilize the word participatory planning here and there, globally, and most importantly in my country also. We do have a nice guideline on that, but it is not properly applied. So I think we have to involve communities. We have to make sure gender considered, I mean, during the planning, the committees and the participation. We have to also look geographic locations, social and economic and biophysical aspects in a kind of balanced way. When you have a clear participatory planning, and if you focus on creating ownership of communities and local leaders about the project or about the land restoration effect, is very important right from the very beginning, but move on throughout the project life in general. The third very important part of the principles: make land restoration or watershed management interventions productive and economically attractive to the smallholder farmer. That's the key for sustainability. So, you know, what we did in our learning landscapes is that we convert conservation structures into cash bands. We introduce utilization arrangement for area closure arrangements, not only to close and to leave it, to make it beautiful, but we make sure that it is also utilized, sustainably utilized. We also introduce a homestead development approach where it has a lot of packages, and it has, and we found out in our sites, it can triple income of household in 2-3 years' time by investing around homesteads. And that has also two major advantages: not only income, but it empowers women. It also improves household nutrition also. And this also should support with zero or controlled grazing. So livestock management should be one of the package, and also engaging or introducing affordable technologies that reduces pressure on land, such as farm tools, but also technologies that reduce post-harvest product management. So, but these are the three major principles that we hope for.
I would just like to interrupt and say that we are running short of time. So if you could kindly close your presentation.
Okay, 2 points. The second point is, I think, institutions. We have to improve institutional capacity, both formal and informal. The third point is policy, particularly land use policy and environment policy. The fourth very important point that the Ethiopian government should also consider is making use of knowledge and data so that policies and actions will be more informed in general. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And there are already some comments for you on the chat, so do have a read. So we have run out of time, but I would like to invite my colleague Anthony Whitbread from ICRISAT to say a final few words. Over to you, Anthony.
Thanks, Deepa. Well, I think I only have 1 or 2 minutes, but I just wanted to say the 3 or 4 major points that I got out of the seminar today. Our objective was really about land restoration and livelihoods, and trying to answer this question: why inclusion and gender equality in rural communities for achieving climate adaptation and mitigation. We've gone a long way towards answering that, and to the audience and the panelists, I think it's an obvious imperative. Firstly, we found that design, culture, history, and capacity of institutions, for example, the watershed departments that we're talking about, and even the agendas that we're creating through to the messaging and design of these agendas, all are important in how we designed restoration agendas. The second one is, I think the major point was that participation of communities is key to success, and balancing these trade-offs of different parts of the community for societal outcomes. I think Padmaja had a good point that gender is too narrow a focus, and we often put too much emphasis on the narrow term of gender, but sometimes it's the minority groups that is also extremely important in these watershed contexts. And the other aspect is, of course, participatory planning that Dr. Zelecki just covered. And the third major area is enhancing livelihoods. And by that, I mean connecting incomes, perhaps through diversification, intensification, and so forth, to the restoration process. And this often will lead to much better sustainability of the restoration process and to better feedback loops, as once we have incomes in the system, land managers are much more purposeful in maintaining structures that we're putting in. So I'd like to hand it back to you, Deepa. I think we've had a great session. I thank very much the panelists and the speakers. And from the flagship in Waterland and Ecosystems, I think we've done a wonderful seminar on this important topic. So from my side, thank you.
Thanks very much, Anthony, and thank you to everybody for attending and presenting. And despite the time limits, I think we really got the message across clear that there is room and need for a much greater attention to gender equality and social inclusion in restoration initiatives, not just because it is morally right, but also because not doing so will impact restoration agendas and restoration outcomes. So with that message and sort of pointer to the upcoming UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration, I would like to end here and thank you once again, everybody, for attending. Thank you so much.